Good morning and welcome back. This is World News coming to you live from Warsaw. I'm Staria Strzemska. Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia have disconnected their electricity systems from Russia's power grid as part of a plan which the Baltic states say will integrate them more closely with the European Union and boost their security. The three countries will synchronize with the EU's grid on Sunday after operating on their own in the meantime. The Baltic states cut themselves off from the Russian power grid in the early hours of Saturday morning, ending an energy dependency that dates back to the 1950s. The move comes as the entire Baltic Sea region is on high alert following a series of power cable, telecom links and gas pipeline outages suspected to be caused by Russian sabotage. All of the recent incidents are believed to have been caused by Russia-linked ships dragging their anchors along the seabed. In response, Poland and the Baltic states have deployed patrol boats and helicopters to boost security and prevent further accidents. Donald Trump has announced that he plans to meet with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy next week. The U.S. president intends to discuss a deal in which the U.S. would continue support for Ukraine in exchange for the supply of rare earth minerals. The American leader also said that he plans to hold a phone conversation with Vladimir Putin.
I will probably be meeting with President Zelenskyy next week, and I will probably be talking to President Putin. I'd like to see that war end. One of the things we're looking at with President Zelenskyy is having the security of their assets. They have assets underground, rare earth and other things, but primarily rare earth.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has shared a hopeful message about the coming weeks, which may be consequential in terms of diplomacy. Zelenskyy expressed confidence in the ongoing collaboration between Ukraine and the US, particularly highlighting his work with President Trump. He noted that both Ukrainian and American teams are working on the details of upcoming meetings with the goal of making progress towards a solid, lasting peace. Ukrainian defense forces shot down 67 out of 139 Russian drones launched overnight. 71 have reportedly disappeared from the raiders without reaching the targets. According to Ivan Fedorov, the governor of the Zaporizhia region, Russian artillery fired at targets more than 150 times and used 180 drones in the past 24 hours. Several houses and apartment blocks were damaged, but there were no reports of death or injuries. A Russian drone attack also caused a fire in an apartment block in Sumy, which has since been put out and no one was injured. U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth will visit Poland next week, the Polish Ministry of National Defense confirmed on Friday, to discuss defense cooperation between the two countries. The visit is part of a week-long trip to Europe, during which Hegseth is also scheduled to visit Germany and Belgium. Hegseth's European trip will begin in Germany, where he is set to visit the U.S. European Command and meet with U.S. servicemen currently stationed in Germany. Hegseth will also attend the NATO defense ministers and the Ukraine Defense Contact Group meetings in Brussels. On the last leg of his tour, the Pentagon chief will travel to Poland, where, as mentioned earlier, he will meet with the Polish defense minister to discuss further bilateral defense cooperation. Hegseth also plans to visit American troops currently stationed in Poland. Tens of thousands of Slovakians gathered in over 30 cities on Friday to rally against the perceived policy shift of Robert Fico's government. The government has slammed demonstrations by claiming protesters are planning a coup d'etat. According to protesters, over 40,000 people gathered in Bratislava's Freedom Square. Protesters continue to demand Fico's resignation, following widespread criticism of his visit to Moscow in December of last year. In the aftermath of his meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin, The Slovakian opposition planned and thereafter rejected a no-confidence motion against the Prime Minister and called for a snap election. Fico rebuked the claims of a pro-Russian turn, saying that while he is critical of some EU policies, his policy is still determined by EU and NATO memberships. Early voting has already begun in Germany, 2 weeks before the parliamentary elections on February 23rd. The snap election was called after Chancellor Olaf Scholz lost the confidence vote in December of last year. The center-right Christian Democratic Union, led by Friedrich Merz, is running on a platform of lowering taxes and putting an end to illegal immigration. Reducing both the income tax and the corporate tax rate will, however, be hard to implement should the CDU refuse to ease the debt brake that limits fresh debt to a minimum of 0.35% of GDP. The Social Democrats want to increase public debt in order to make necessary investments, such as in infrastructure, and have opted for a much softer stance on immigration. The far-right AfD centered their platform on anti-EU sentiment, calling for Germany to leave the bloc and the Eurozone, as well as to limit migration and resume imports of Russian gas. We are witnessing the Georgian authorities taking further steps away from democratic standards, said EU High Representative Kaja Kallas and Commissioner for Enlargement Marta Kos in a joint statement on Friday. According to the EU officials, the Georgian government is resorting to, quote, growing intimidation techniques, including violence to silence dissidents. They also emphasize that those accountable for repressive actions, including against independent journalists, must be held accountable. In their statement, Kallas and Kos also emphasized that the EU is ready to support Georgia's European integration and efforts towards democratization. We consider it likely that Russian intelligence will attempt to carry out acts of sabotage against Norway in 2025. That was the stark warning delivered by the head of the Norwegian Police Security Service. The agency said in its annual threat assessment published this week that for the first time in 80 years, the country finds itself in the so-called grey zone between a state of war and peace due to threats from neighboring Russia.
The Norwegian Police Security Service now considers it likely that Russian intelligence will attempt to carry out acts of sabotage against targets in Norway in 2025.
Since we presented last year's threat assessment, the world has become more dangerous.
What we see that has happened in other countries includes arson, property damage, trying to target industry, or anything that could contribute to deliveries in Ukraine.
What I mean when I say that people are a bit naive now is that the work is proceeding too slowly. We see the threat growing, but not enough is being done to establish very concrete measures to reduce the risk.
We are not at war, but we are clearly not at peace either, said Sweden's Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson during a joint press conference with his Latvian counterpart Evika Siliņa. NATO's Baltic states leaders gathered at the Adazi military base near Riga on Friday for a celebration welcoming Sweden, which is officially joining the NATO multinational brigade based in Latvia.
We are very pleased that more than 500 troops from Sweden will be deployed in Latvia and work together with the 13 other allied countries here. Together, we will reinforce our defense and military capabilities, and this will be proof of our collective defense and deterrence ability. So within NATO and our mutual cooperation, we will continue to deter further attacks on our infrastructure. We will cooperate to also deal with the shadow fleet of Russia in the Baltic Sea, which not only threatens our infrastructure but also pollutes our waters. We will also continue supporting Ukraine through strengthening the sanction policy and applying further sanctions against Russian and Belarusian products. We see that we have to go against those sectors that provide the most profits to Russia, that being the energy sector, where we also have to discontinue any imports.
Our shared Baltic Sea region is also affected by Russia's hybrid warfare. We are obviously not at war, but we are equally obviously not at peace either. The grain zones are too many and the hybrid attacks are too frequent. When the Prime Minister and I met last spring in Stockholm, just a month after Sweden joined NATO, I announced that my government gave Sweden's armed forces the formal task of planning and preparing for a Swedish contribution of a mechanized battalion to NATO's Forward Land Forces Brigade here in Latvia. Now the first unit from Skånska regementet P7, now you have learned some Swedish, have been in Latvia for exactly 3 weeks. Their presence here and the task they will perform, working side by side with other allied soldiers and under the command of Canada, is a true illustration of NATO at its strongest.
A federal judge has refused to block Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency from accessing the U.S. Department of Labor's systems. The ruling is a setback for government employee unions opposing the dismantling of federal bureaucracy. The temporary ruling released on Friday by U.S. District Judge John Bates in Washington, D.C. is the first step in a union lawsuit against the Labor Department. The union alleges that Musk could obtain sensitive information about investigations into his own companies and competitors by accessing government computer systems. Justice Bates stressed that while he has some concerns about Musk's conduct, the union has failed to show that it had suffered as a result of his actions. Numerous lawmakers and advocacy groups have decried the recent moves by saying that Musk is overstepping his authority and seeking to dismantle agencies responsible for critical government programs. And then moving to the Middle East, 3 Israeli hostages are set to be released by Hamas in exchange for Palestinian prisoners held in Israeli captivity in the 5th such swap since both sides agreed to a ceasefire which came into force on the 19th of January. Eli Sharabi, Ohad Ben Ami and Or Levi were all captured during the 2023 October 7th incursion into southern Israel, which sparked the war in Gaza. 18 of the 33 hostages to be released in the first stage of the ceasefire have now been released in exchange for 400 Palestinian prisoners and detainees. According to the B'Tselem, an Israeli Center for Human Rights, there are currently more than 10,000 Palestinians incarcerated in Israeli prisons. More than 70 people captured during the October 7th attack remain in Hamas's captivity. And that's a wrap for World News. Thank you for watching and please stay tuned for more.